and welcome to the program. This is Vivek Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. The poisoning of former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal has set off a diplomatic storm between the UK and Russia, and now the US and the EU has joined Great Britain in maintaining that Moscow is responsible. Relations between the West and Russia have fallen to lows not seen since the Cold War. So to discuss recent developments in this case, we're joined in the studio by Oleksandr Khara, a political expert with Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Oleksandr, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I'd like to start off with these allegations about the poisoning. So Russia alleges that the UK was behind staging this. Now, what led to this type of what seems very absurd allegations?
Well, it's just typical behavior of the Russian authorities to blame the others for their misdeeds. And we have, Ukrainians have experience of such things. If we get back to a couple of years ago when the Malaysian airliner was shut down by the Russian missiles, and the Russians were blaming Ukrainian military air force and then the Ukrainian armed forces for this tragedy, for this actually war crime. And in reality, according to the international investigation, according to the open source intelligence that we have, it is Russia that supplied to our territory these missiles, rockets. And the same thing with the poisoning of Mr. Skripal. We know for sure that it's only Russia and the Soviet Union in the first place was developing such kind of chemical weapons. It was Russia where it was stored. None of the the Soviet republics were involved in the development of these weapons or storage of it. According to the recent information, the British are saying that this type of chemicals was produced at least 10 years ago. So this is time frame where the Russian authorities were supposed to destroy all types of chemical weapons according to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So we see the breach of international law. We see the politically motivated killings on the soil of the sovereign state. And we've seen that is the consequent action of the government of Russia, because at least 14 other cases on the British soil could be traced back to the Kremlin.
Right, and they're looking at exhuming bodies, looking at if there's a connection and trying to trace down other possible cases of poisoning. And there's some precedents on the soil of Britain as we look back with the poisoning of the former agent for using plutonium, a very specific to Russia. So what is it seems just not something that's very intelligent to use specific chemicals that are only produced, that can only be traced to Russia.
Well, the reason why the Soviet Union decided to develop new type of new agent was firstly to avoid the terms of the Chemical Prohibition Convention, and the components of this weapon are not prohibited by this convention. That's why it's good to avoid the responsibility. Secondly, the idea was to create such a chemical that is not detected, but at that time available to NATO and other countries' equipment. And third, it should be deadly and it should get through to any type of the protective armors and protective equipment. So I believe that the people in the Kremlin were thinking that the trace to the Kremlin would not be revealed because of this, let's say, exotic type of poisoning. And before that, there were several cases when the British authorities just closed down the investigation because of the lack of evidence. And the people who died under the strange circumstances, for example, in one case, in the stomach of one victim there was a type of flower that was more common to find in the Asian region, not on the island. And that's why someone brought this poisoning type of
flower into the...
So the Russians are masters in such kind of political killings, not just in the United Kingdom, but in other countries as well. So there is a trace, and that's why this evidence gave the right for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to require the Russian explanation, and two explanations could be possible brought by the Russians. Either it was a political killing authorized by Mr. Putin, or it was just misconduct of this deadly weapon, and this deadly weapon fall into the wrong hands. The Russians denied any connection, and certainly they begin this disinformation campaign, blaming even Ukrainians that we are involved in this killing, because it was in our interest to spoil the relations between the United Kingdom and Russia. So the Russians are trying to use a motivation or the rhetoric to prove their innocence. At the same time, the British are showing not just the common sense, but they proved that it's Russian chemical. So we will see the investigation of the Chemical Convention organization that will prove that it's a Novichok type of agent, and then certainly that it was produced in Russia. In fact, the Sporting Down facility, one of the most developed laboratories on chemical weapons, it was them who proved not just poisoning by Mr. Litvinenko by the plutonium, but exactly a power unit where this plutonium was generated. So I believe that the science level of this utility would help the British authorities to prove that Russia is behind this killing.
And of course, they're playing their cards very close. They're not going to give all of the information that they know about the origins of this nerve agent. Of course, they, as you say, they most likely have a lot of good details, and then they're leaving Russia to try to have to scramble. So, as we know, as you said, they do an aggressive front and trying to turn the tables. So we're looking now at the aftermath and what's developing from this. And so we have the expulsion of the 23 diplomats. And of course, we're seeing this diplomatic tit for tat now. So where do you see this going? How far do you see this escalation possibly heading for?
Well, on the bilateral level, there will be other actions by the British government, and the most painful ones. The Prime Minister announced that the British government would look closely to the Russian finances, Russian property owned by the state officials or oligarchs close to the Putin regime. This is the most painful thing, because London is a sort of a gateway, financial gateway to the world for Russian oligarchs. Secondly, there will be other actions with regard to the protection of the borders. And there will be more, how to say, attention to the Russian citizens passing by the United Kingdom or flying to Kingdom by private jets.
And so this seems like this is going to be the most painful. We've seen these other sanctions, perhaps they haven't been painful enough. And so this may be the most painful targeting. And hopefully we're going to see this as setting a precedent in other countries as well, in France and other EU countries, where they're targeting this type of financial sanctioning of people, investors.
Yes, that's right. There is a global Magnitsky Act, and the British are trying to amend it to actually address not just the case of Magnitsky, but wider violations of the human rights by Russian authorities and the Russian citizens close to the Putin circle. Certainly, there will be some common response from the European part. At one hand, the Europeans are not willing to impose new sanctions. At the same time, where they understand that this aggressive behavior should be met with some resolve. And we've seen that the European Commission stated that they condemned Russia, and Russia was highly likely involved in this accident. At the same time, we see that the United States is aligned itself with the United Kingdom. There was allegation from the permanent representatives of the United States to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, and the Rex Tillerson's comments as well. Unfortunately, he was fired after that, and there is some connection between the Russian issue in the mind of Mr. Trump. But so, there is a front of the West to face the Russian aggression in the United Kingdom and elsewhere.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. But as this case develops, we're going to make sure that we get you back on and get some comments from you, because this certainly is going to be something that's going to be developing, and we're going to keep our eye on. Thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you for having me.
Today, we were joined by Oleksandr Khara, a political expert with Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for joining us.